So, who was Alfred Chandler? He was a man who started his academic work mostly after the Second World War, having served in the US Navy, and he's one of the first researchers in business history and strategy. That is why he's important to us. When talking about Chandler, it's not important to think how correct he was in the long run, how correct he was proved to be. It's the fact that he was one of the first, if not the first, to properly research and look into the ideas of business and strategy. And I want to hear because it's business history, as we're trying to understand the broader picture of how governance has developed over time and what makes it important and how this relates to responsible management, responsible business. His method was simple. He came up with the idea to simply look at all the successful companies around at the time and see if there was some individual thing, some specific thing that would help, that would explain their success. And what he decided was that it was most likely that as they all had the same structure, the M form of organization, he decided this was actually the main driver of their success. So he had a number of bodies of work that I think is important for us to think about. His majors were strategy and structure, in which he talked about the visible hand. He termed the Managerial Revolution. American Business, the publishing house, produced this in 1977, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it covered the scale and scope covering the dynamics of industrial capitalism, which he went on to further develop in a later book. He looked at the work of Adam Smith, who had talked about the wealth of nations. His argument basically was the growth of large corporations was a pushback against the invisible hand. He said that whereas Adam Smith identified the invisible hand, we now had the visible hand, which was that managers who were the ones who were running capitalism, and that this was a great successful system. It was a system that brought America to the great position it held in the world at the time. He believed that the strength of the US economy was all down to this structure, and he believed the structure of the company was the key to their success, and the governance of the company being separated out from ownership and control was a good thing. Among other things that he produced as well, he co-edited an anthology later on with Franco Amatori and Takashi Hikino, Big Business and the Wealth of Nations. This was part of the thing we'll look at later as to why people have been criticising his work for not taking a note of East Asian work, mostly concentrated on the US and to a lesser extent German, British capitalism, we'll see later. So what was he talking about when he talked about the visible hand? Well, up to the 1840s and in the 1850s, businesses had been family businesses and they'd been owned by the people who ran them. But as they got bigger, they started to employ professional managers and developed the M form, which was a very successful form. What was driving this forward? Well, his core ideas were basically around the fact that massive technological growth was going on. Right? So what was the thing that especially in transport communications, the telegraph, the railway, etc. And this actually allowed customers to communicate across bigger areas. And this just have branches in different cities. Prior to this, it was unusual just to have more than one factory managed and owned by the same people. So this was one of the driving forces behind this technical growth, and this was causing the expansion of capitalism. And some countries were able to manage the growth of capitalism, and he believed America was one of them through the formation of the M form. And other countries that failed to adopt the M form were unable to manage capitalist growth in the same way. So he's talking about the visible hand replacing the invisible hand. He had a lot of military metaphors at the time. Obviously, so he talked about the mobilization of capital. It's obviously a military metaphor. In these arguments, he said that the visible hand was replacing the invisible hand. So Adam Smith claimed that capitalism was managed invisibly. His comments were, it is not by the good nature of the baker and the people who are fed, but actually it's in their own interests. And all people enacting their own interests meant the market was invisible, but managed an organized capitalism. Chandler basically argued against this, basically saying the hidden hand of the market no longer organized capitalism. What organized capitalism now was big business, and this led to the ideas of corporate government and the military-industrial concept. The concept of the CEO president. So you get the idea of these big organizations being run from the center. He did to a certain extent start to talk about the ideas of agencies and systems, which we'll look at in other videos, but this was before these became standard economic terms, and his work was very descriptive in nature as he was looking at what it was, not trying to formulate a theory. And so, although he can be said to identify some of the areas of... Okay, so what's the summary? He argued that there were two major points in US history. There were two major periods. There was a tradition pre-1850 where you had the market economy, the concept of perfect competition you learned about managerial business economics. This was a system that was set up and was done by the invisible hand, the hidden hand of the market. And this was running everything, but post 1950s, you've got expansion. You've got bigger organizations. You started to get this managerial capitalism. The idea that capitalism was no longer about the free market. It's been run by business. Been run by people who knew what they were doing. These people who were successful people, so they were the ones that put in charge of business. Of course, we've around this time, 1856, there's something else going in America, something which he practically ignores. And what he actually ignores is the American Civil War, which is a major thing that killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, Vietnam and Korea wars combined. And so one of the arguments going on is that whereas he was claiming it was to do with managerial capitalism and it was to do with the M form, what actually happened to cause American major economic growth at the time was American unification. When America won its independence from Great Britain in the late 17th century, it was actually done so in a manner in which was much more confederate than federated. And it was only in the American Civil War, the early 1860s, 1861 to 1865, that it did eventually achieve full unity and full unification. And that was when America became a nation, a United Nation. So this meant that actually, at this period, so what was he talking about there in Scale and Scope? Scale and Scope, a later book, he went on to compare why the USA was successful, but also at the same time, he had a look at some other countries. He looked specifically at British and German firms, which he actually said British and German and US were different forms of capitalism. In Great Britain, you had something which he called personal capitalism, which was based on the old boy network, the old families, the aristocracy. You had new money coming in and helping out and helping them deal with it. But on the whole, it was a personal network. Whereas in the United States, you had a much more competitive nature, so he called competitive capitalism. But he felt this was stronger, more sturdy. He looked at it in militaristic terms. I felt the United States was very competitive capitalism, where people would struggle against one another, and this struggle was the dynamic force of capitalism, a kind of creative destruction, as Trump described it, if you like, and that is often what's talked about. The United States had a competitive capitalism. But in Germany, they had a more cooperative approach, where people made deals and agreements, and businesses and management and employees worked together. For example, the concept of the double boards in America, where you have a board that oversees the company, we have a secondary board that takes on the ethical, more stakeholder approach to things. This cooperative capitalism meant there was less direct competition between firms, and there was less conflict in worker management. And this led to a less dynamic form of capitalism. For Chandler, the conflict inherent in capitalism wasn't a sideshow, it was very, very important. But he did say that the commonality between German, British, and United States capitalism, because all was successful to a certain extent, was that their large industrial firm had been the engine of growth. This was the primary adaptation. The primary adaptation, he identified the large industrial firm as the M form. See a picture of what the M form is. Quite so it's simple. The idea here was that you had all these different people reporting to a central leadership, but they had the important structures that set it up in a manner that allowed them to develop, because they were able to run all the different sections from the centre. And this he believed was the main reason for growth. This was the reason for success, and that companies that adopted the M form, they succeeded, and that companies that not adopted the M form, it did not succeed. And he directly linked it to whether your national capitalism was competitive, was it cooperative or personal. In the end came down to the fact that all these different firms used the M form to structure their companies, and it became ubiquitous across the group there. So the problem he's ignoring, though, to a certain extent, the US itself, like I said, is coming into existence at the time. As the US expanded, though, it moved to what they claimed to be virgin territories. Of course, it was ignoring the fact that these were all already occupied by Native Americans. He believed that they were empty, and this was the United States that had given them right to move and build a new industrial landscape. This meant there was unity in the US in a way that wasn't, for instance, in Europe. At this time, Germany was unifying, but Europe, even today, is made up of independent states. This attempt to copy the ability of growth of the US could be part of the European Union project. The idea being that we break down boundaries and become like one country, one economy, but it's a long way behind. The other pro-United States argument is that it's the size of the market that's benefiting the US. Or is it the fact that the US growing and boosting the size of the market? So which is it? Is the market growing, or is the US growing and this leads to a bigger market? So the cause and effect is difficult to identify here. A growing market, greater wealth, allows the country to expand, or is the country expand into what it sees as virgin territory, which of course then boosts the size of its market and allows it to generate greater wealth. What he actually meant. The way he implemented his work. Well, he studied 4 basic corporations: Standard Oil, General Electric, US Steel, and DuPont. They were basically all M-form companies. Because, of course, what's interesting, of course, that Alfred Chandler DuPont was his name. So he's actually one of the major things he was studying was one of his own family companies. This is a man who, following his naval career, got into academia, but he had a large source of private income, also had access to research that other people may not have had. And of course, it means that your own research is not completely unbiased if you're talking about the source of your own wealth. You may well be tempted to look back at it in the same way that many people who look back and say that although they accept the base of their wealth historically was slavery, although they prefer it, it's over, they prefer not to talk about it. They don't want people to particularly know about this, so that it's thinking about this. So his thesis is that the structure of the firms leads to success. And there's just the basic idea that he's effective, and there are good reasons why he might want to push this, rather than actually accept that some of the reasons may have been less savoury, that there may have been reasons about the development of US capitalism, the companies that he represented were looking at and talk about. Okay. However, it starts to become obvious, and we mentioned this a bit already, that there was a big hole in his work, in that it did not include any of Far East Asia, specifically at the time of the wealth it should have included Japan. So there's very little work in Japan. And he reserves other things doing that. There's an accusation of that there are certain factual inaccuracies. I mean, for instance, he's looking back at the tales of history, he's talking about the nature and development of America, and he's ignoring things for instance, about the nature of expansion, the nature of America, exceptionalism, etc. He is false distribution. He's actually saying that effectively that these countries were successful. These companies were successful because they were smarter. He's ignoring the fact that the nature of their growth at the time was becoming very questionable, to the point where Franklin D. Roosevelt actually broke up many of these companies because the way they obtained their wealth, the way they obtained their rights to, for instance, oil development, the way they tied to land on which to build railways, the way they tied access to raw materials for DuPont to make the chemicals, etc., actually was questionable. There was some suggestion that had not been done. There was the agency problems. He just completely ignored this. He started to explore the mining and then drop them. Because what he's actually arguing, the agency problem is the idea that somebody working for somebody else, separation of ownership control, creates a conflict. But he simply denied the conflict. He simply said, no. His argument was basically around the fact these were all good lads, they were all good people, they'd gone to the same universities, etc., and that he would doing that. Okay, so there was basically he ignored that we mentioned the varieties of capitalism. He ignored the success of Asian family firms. He ignored the existence of the state as a multi-divisional enterprise model. He just talked about the companies. He did not have any note on transaction cost theory. He did not talk about expropriation theory. Expropriation theory is quite important, so we go about that. He starts later to try and develop his work further, looking to areas like Japan, but there are other criticisms and alternative views to his work. Some work was simply inaccurate. Elsewhere, he talks about the slave plantations of the South as if they're just another form of business. There's nothing special about them. Then he talked about the fact that they ran them not using M-form. If you're allowed to have the M-form and allowed slaves to go off and work somewhere else, they'd just go off. They wouldn't come back. They were slaves. You had to have them in prison. He didn't seem to have any understanding of these issues. He just attributed success to the M-form. To a lot of people, the M-form was just a default setting. It wasn't an imaginative or design structure. Simply put, if you're a growing business, if you have bigger businesses, you weren't able to sit and watch everything directly. You needed people to manage it. Therefore, you need to format it in which they report back to a head office. The M-form therefore came into existence. Many people argued for this particular reason, not because of any other reason. He's ignored to a great extent transaction cost and agency problems. Although he edited never some of the proto-agency problems, I addressed this in the video later on agency, he ignored them in discussion. He basically believed people did the right thing. They were all decent lads together. They all went to the same schools, all went to the same universities. They were all white, all men, and all would do the right thing as there was no dishonour in business. So, he ignored the varieties of capitalism. He ignored the success of Asian family firms. He struggled a little bit to understand the idea that state itself as a multifaceted enterprise. He ignored the fear that people were actually taking money from elsewhere, that they were taking things that didn't actually belong to them. There's a certain commercial capital expropriation that was happening in the States. The whole country was being accumulated to expropriation from the original inhabitants. History actually shows as well that when his book was published in 1977, if anything, that was the high point of the multinational firm. And the high point of many of the state-owned big business as well. We've actually seen fairly around the 80s, the rise of factories and the rise of Reaganism starts to dismantle these big corporate institutions, and many of them actually cannot compete in the modern world. And so actually, just as he's declaring the M form, it's starting to die out. It's important though to remember that, as I said at the beginning, Chandler is important because he introduced the concept of researching these ideas. He introduced the idea, the concept, and should be therefore considered. It's not actually that relevant whether or not he's correct, but it's how solid a foundation later work is based on his. So remember, the main thing that he was ignoring is the fact that was benefiting from things that were actually not controlled by business or government control, such as the unified legal system, the ability to enforce contracts across a geographical area. Unlike in Europe, in a more divided Europe, where of course you had different legal systems, and courts tend to rule in favour of their own variety of capitalism. Thanks for listening. Please also watch this video in line with the videos on Burl and Cook.